Hello everyone. In this video we're going to take our first steps in learning how to create objects in Fusion 360. There are a lot of ways to do this and it really depends on what we're trying to create. We're going to start off with something very simple. It's not an actual thing in the real world. It's not like an object. I like to call it a couch because it kind of reminds me of one, but it's actually just a very kind of odd 3D shape with different features on it. So we're comfortable trying out different tools. One of the first ways of designing things, it's kind of the easiest and most beginner-friendly way, is to kind of start by creating 2D sketches, drawing flat drawings with closed shapes, putting set measurements, and then when we're ready, we move into stretching this into 3D. A lot of our kind of process has to be thinking in multiple kind of mindsets. One mindset is, what does it look like in a flat constant 2D view? What does that look like? What are the measurements in one direction or in two directions only? And then when we're ready, we stretch things into 3D. And then in that 3D kind of view or 3D object, then we can do more manipulations. And those 3D objects often have faces on them, flat surfaces, and we can draw sketches on those surfaces. And it kind of is this iterative process of draw a 2D shape, stretch it into 3D, manipulate some aspect, draw another 2D sketch either on a surface or on kind of a blank area, and do this again and again and again. This is one approach. It's not the only way, but it is usually the first kind of step. So I'm going to show you what we're going to create, and then from there we can kind of take steps together to talk about this. And we'll talk about how to create sketches, 2D sketches, and stretch them into 3D and so on. So here's the object I would like to make. And again, it's not really anything meaningful. It's just kind of a bunch of things stuck together. I call it a couch because it kind of reminds me of one. It has like arms and has the back part. But it also has some features that are kind of hard or different. They're not necessarily what we expect. Cuttings on the corners. These are not flat corners, but there's an indentation. There's also a giant hole that's a square cut through, and this surface is at an angle. So this is only one view. Unfortunately, I do not have a better kind of multi-view of this just yet. I will be able to do so once we create this in 3D. We're able to create a very similar sketch with the same idea with measurements and so on. Notice this is all in millimeters, so that's our measurement, our unit this time around. But if you're making something realistic, a larger object, if you were making actual furniture, then you might do things in meters because the furniture often is a lot larger than being in millimeters. So we have to kind of pick where we want to start, and there's not like one right answer. It really depends on what you're aiming to do. And so what I'm going to try to do, I think, is if I were to be looking at this kind of object from the side here, coming along this angle and seeing this is a flat surface, can I make this shape, this shape? And so I see that it's kind of rectangular, it comes along this way, this is almost a square, and then at some point either cuts off and then has like an angled surface. I can also consider that this, if I were to imagine if this corner was not chopped out, it's almost like a triangle or a trapezoid where it's flat on the top and then cut off. But we do have, if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines, it looks like, to create this flat image. So we're going to do that first. We're not going to do it with measurements. We're just going to create the shape, and then we can talk about, how do we put an exact measurement? How do I make a line 21 millimeters or 26 millimeters and so on? So, as a reminder, you should hopefully have made a single project. I can show you mine in my data panel. My project is called CAD T12324, and I have it pinned so I can always come back to it easily. So I'm going to close my data panel. And by default, you can see there's one giant tab. I have an untitled project, and the idea is that I'm going to work on something, and then when I save it, it'll allow me to give it a name. And every time we make a save, it overwrites the save like you'd expect, but it also gives it a version number. So the idea is that you don't want to save every 5 seconds. What you want to do is make some meaningful progress in some fashion and then save. So that way you have different stages to the same thing. And if you ever decide, I want to change my view, then I can go back to a different version. And then that way I can kind of have like branching versions. So maybe version 1 has a particular idea inside of it, but then it didn't work out so great. And then we're going to try version 2. But the idea is that as long as we have different versions, we can always kind of jump back in the past almost to what we had created before and go from there. So we'll save at some point and see how that works. The first thing we want to do is, how do we make a 2D sketch? How do I draw in this 3D space a flat 2D image? In our workspace for design, this first leftmost section is called the Create section, and there are a bunch of options. These are all default. All of these are available also through this drop-down, but these are the most common ones, and if you see that first one, hover over it, it gives us a little tooltip, and it says, create sketch, right? It says enter sketch mode, which means we're drawing a 2D sketch. And then we can make what it say geometric profiles, right? 2D shapes that have measurements and limitations and different things, and they can be extruded into 3D, and we'll talk about all the different things. They mentioned extrusion, revolving, lofting, and so on. And you can see they give us an example of a kind of a shape there, and how we can do all kinds of things. But there's a lot of options. So I'm going to click on this button, Create Sketch. The first thing we'll notice is that 3 kind of yellow-looking squares appeared, and they are actually in 3 dimensions, and these are the planes. Remember, if we're in 3D space, there are 3 axes, right? The X, Y, and Z, and we can see those colored lines represent them, right? And then, of course, if you look at any 2 axes together, they create a 2D plane. Right? And so the reality is the sum of all 3 of these 2D planes is a 3D space. So we have to pick, well, what plane do you want our drawing to be on? And so just as a kind of reminder, if we look at our picture, I claimed, from my perspective, I see this as like the side of this couch object, of this object. So I'm going to think I'll pick, well, this is the Z, this is the X, and then this, and then forward and backward might be the Y. Or the Z could also be forward and backward. So we have to decide on what it is. I think I'm going to have this line be the X, these lines going this way, the Y, and up and down, the Z. So with that said, if that's how I'm going to consider my view, I think my sideways picture should be this one. And you can notice it's going to show me what the plane would look like. We would see the X and, I think the X and Z, the Y and Z axes as our flat surface. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this. And notice it rotates it. And there we can see that we have the Z, and then we're seeing the X. So let's go ahead and draw a shape. Notice something that's changed. We are in a sketch mode, and we can see that there's what's called a sketch palette with a bunch of different options. And he has a button that says Finish Sketch. So it says, look, when you're ready and you've completed your 2D drawing, you can actually go back to the 3D view of things. And then there's a bunch of other menus. Now the Create menu is different. This Create menu has 2D shapes, and we can draw lines, we can draw rectangles, circles, more advanced what they call splines, which are for curved lines, and there's a bunch of other interesting things that we'll see. There's quite a few options, and each of these has different ways of doing things. So I can't go through them all, but we have a lot of variety that we could come up with. The first thing I want to do is, again, looking back at our picture, I mentioned there's 6 lines that I think are useful, and so I'm going to use the line tool to kind of draw these lines roughly and go from there. So I'm going to click on this button, and notice my cursor has changed. It says, look, place the first point. It has a little icon that looks like the picture, so I know I'm in the line tool, and it has a crosshair. Now, where I do this is whatever there's no definitive area where I need to start it, but some things are like snap to. So if I go to the origin, notice how it says, oh, look, I recognize the origin, and that way that corner point would be there. So I'm going to use that as my starting point. It's not necessary, but it is convenient. So I'm going to click on it, and as soon as I do notice it gives me some information, it shows me, oh, what's the angle from one of the axes? It tells me what's the length in millimeters, right? And where the next point is going to be. And so I can do all kinds of things to my advantage to figure out where I want it to go. I'm going to go directly horizontally to the right. That's my first line. I'm going to go up. And notice now it says, oh, how many degrees, and I can rotate it and so on. Same concept. I'm going to go up. That's going to be that kind of back part of the of my couch object. You can see some things that kind of show up. If you look at the bottom right corner where the 2 lines are going to be connected, there's that kind of little 90-degree symbol on top of the fact that we see that it says 90 degrees. We'll do that. I'm going to click. There's my next point. There was kind of, and I'll come back to it, so you can see that we have this kind of top line. So I've done this. I've gone from here to here. I've gone from here to here. And my next one is going to be going across. So either this line or this line. They're basically the same. And then I'm going to go down at an angle, and then I'm going to close it off and then go down one last time. So here I am. I've gone up. I'm going to go across just a little bit. Doesn't really matter the numbers. And then I'm going to go down at an angle. Again, not important necessarily where I go. And actually, what I think is I'm going to make an adjustment. Instead of using this line, I think I'm going to kind of say, you know what? It's just one giant trapezoid with a straight diagonal. So instead of kind of going here and then going sideways, I'm just going to go directly to it. That's what I'm going to start with. Right? This is kind of a change I decided. Maybe it will work out easier for us. There's not one correct way. There are many ways, so this is the way I'm choosing to do this. I'm going to click it, and notice if you make a closed shape, it stops asking me for the next point. I still have the tool on, so I have to be careful not to click and make a new one, but you can see that it made a closed shape, and it kind of shades in the light blue, or sometimes other colors, that this is the closed shape. To get rid of this tool, I'm going to hit escape on my keyboard. So now notice I'm back to my regular cursor. And I can see this closed shape. When I hover over the kind of shaded area, it says, that's the closed shape, and that's what I wanted. Other things to note, there are some symbols that start to pop up. So there's one right here, there's one right here. These are what are called constraint symbols or constraints. A constraint is a limitation on what our lines and shapes can do. And the way this is going to work is that you want to put as many constraints as necessary to lock down the shape to an exact formation. So measurements are a form of constraint. Horizontal constraints are another one. We'll see there's quite a few, and you can see there's a section called constraints that has a lot of different options. And sometimes they're automatic. It's smart enough to kind of figure it out for us. Other times we have to manually or choose them ourselves. And so I'll point out some constraints that are for us. This first constraint is the horizontal constraint. It says, look, this line here that's darker blue must be horizontal. So it cannot be at an angle. And that was just because I trapped it to the origin and went directly sideways. I could have done an angled line, but now that it's trapped with this constraint, I cannot move it. The way you know that a line or shape is what we call fully constrained, locked in place definitively, is the color changes. This line is black. This line cannot be moved in any way. Right? These other lines happen to be a light blue, and that's because they can be manipulated in some fashion. In fact, I can grab this, for example, vertex, and drag it. You can see those lines change, but that black line does not change, right? I choose this vertex. Now, you'll see that the measurement changes, but the actual black line cannot be anything but horizontal. I cannot drag this down. I'm actually clicking and dragging, and I cannot move it down. I cannot move it up. I let go, and you can see that it's back to normal. So I can manipulate things freely until they're constrained. The more constraints you have, the better eventually, because you want to lock it so that it's definitive in what it's supposed to be in every kind of facet that you need, right? Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you have some things unconstrained just because you're not sure of a measurement, or you want to eventually do something else with it. But good practice says the more constraints you have in your sketch, the better off you'll be in the future. So, and one other constraint I'll mention that's maybe not totally clear until you click on it. If I hover over one of these vertices, right? Remember, a edge or line is a line between two vertices. A vertex is a single point in space. And a closed shape is a connection of multiple edges. And that little symbol that looks like, it's actually basically this one right here is what we call a coincident constraint. And it says, look, there are actually two vertices here. One vertex is the left vertex of this horizontal line, and the other vertex is this is a vertex that's connected to this diagonal line. So they're connected or coincident with one another. So they are in the same spot. So that's why when I drag it, both lines are moved. So we have a rough trapezoid. Let's put some measurements on it, and maybe that'll lock things down and constrain things a little bit better. So let's go back to our drawing. And so first things first, the easiest one I think is this long horizontal line from front corner to back corner, 26 millimeters. So this line, as I move it around, is different. I don't know how long it is, but let's make it 26. One button we use to give dimensions or measurements is called the dimension or sketch dimension button. The button is available right here. It's very common. It's also at the very bottom of our create menu. And notice there's also a letter. This is a keyboard shortcut. So D stands for dimension or sketch dimension. So I can click on this, I can click on this, or I can just tap D on my keyboard. I'm going to click on it. The way we know this tool is active, notice the cursor. It's now black and has the little kind of picture that looks just like that button. The way this is going to work, and again, this is very flexible, we can click on something and then click the dimension button, or we can click the dimension button and then click on a part of our sketch. There's a lot of ways to do it. I'm going to click on this line. When I do, notice what happens is that it gives me, we can see numbers and it tells me, well, how long, what is the distance between these two things? I'm going to click on it once. You can place this is just kind of the visual measurement thing, but I can click and let go, and now I can type it out. So it's really kind of a very specific number. I'm going to type it out. We said it was 26 millimeters. It's already by default millimeters, so I can just hit enter, and we can see 26 is where it is, right? I don't have to type mm. It's assumed to be that as part of our default. And there you can see D1, 26 mm. So notice something, this kind of broke the situation because now the lines are kind of overlapping. So I should probably, just to keep the general shape, drag this one. Actually, before I do that, I have to get rid of the tool, so I'm going to hit escape. And now I'm back to my original cursor. and I can drag this one. And now, because it is a lot smaller, I'm going to zoom in. So I'm going to zoom, and there it is. So we're a little bit better. Let's go ahead and do another dimension. So this was 26 across here. Another one I can do is this back height. It's 21 for here, but I had mentioned that this is like a kind of a corner cut out. So I'm going to pretend that wasn't there. So the full height from very bottom to very, very top is 21 millimeters plus 5 millimeters, a total of 26. In fact, that's just like the bottom. So I'm going to choose my dimension button, or I can press D on the keyboard. I'm going to select this line, and I'm going to put 26 millimeters. And there it is, and notice how it stretches. So notice some things. I'm going to hit escape. As I've done this, this line is fully constrained. It's black. I can't move it. In fact, I can't do really anything here at all. I'm grabbing this vertex, and it's locked in place. It's perpendicular because it's a 90-degree angle here. It's horizontal. This line is vertical. Even though it's not constrained to be vertical, it's trapped because we gave it a set height. So some constraints are implicit. So if we think about it, if this line is horizontal and it's connected to this line, and the degree between them is 90 degrees, the implication is that this line must be vertical. There is not a vertical constraint. You would see something like this kind of vertically if it was, but it's constrained implicitly by the fact that the 90-degree angle between them forces this to be straight up, right? That's just kind of a reality of the geometry. But we could have put the constraint instead of the 90 degrees, and that would have worked out too. It just depends on how we want to do things. The last thing we really want to do is this one, and what is this length of line? Let's take a look. Do we know this actual value? I don't know that we do, and I don't think that it's important that we do, right? We have this one, we have this one. Now, what we do know maybe is that top line. How wide is it? Again, here we don't see a measurement, so this one is harder to know, but we can see right here, from this corner to this corner, or in our sketch, that's basically from here to here, right? This line, it says is 5 millimeters. Let's use that number. So I'm going to pan to the top. There it is. I'm going to zoom in a bit. Right. I'm going to select the line. So here I'm doing it a little bit differently. Instead of pressing the dimension tool and then the line, here I press the line first, and then I can click the dimension tool and notice what it does. It gives me that right there. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to put 5 millimeters and hit enter. And there we go. Now if I zoom out, go back to the center, notice something. All lines are constrained, including this one. I didn't put a measurement on it, but it is in fact constrained because, again, the implication is if this line is horizontal and there's a 90-degree angle, and this one now is vertical, and we know the measurement of this one and this one, and we know this one, the only way this line could be where it is, connected where it is, would be being a particular length. If you're curious, if you select it with the dimension tool, it'll tell us the number, but we can't notice what it does. We cannot actually tell it to be a different size, because if we try to constrain it, it says, hey, I already know where I'm supposed to be. Do not try to do this, right? So it gives us some other options. We're not going to mess with this driven dimension just yet. But the idea is that we don't need to know how wide it is. And it complains, and we can always come back to that later on. But we don't need to put a constraint or measurement on that line. So we're going to stop this video here. Think about what we've done so far. We have done our basic line tool in our sketch. We've used the dimension tool, and we've mentioned some constraints, limitations on this. In the next video, we'll continue with this object and move it into 3D and do a lot more.